Hello everyone, how's it going? In this video I wanted to go ahead and show you how to make this exact scene in front of you. We will be using Blender as always. However, this tutorial will be slightly different and longer in duration than usual. I have done absolutely no prior preparation to the video, so what you see in front of you is an extremely raw workflow which allows you to make a nice looking scene with certain slight compromises, but it will take a really short time to make. Now, as always, all necessary assets are linked down below for you to follow along, and if this interests you, stay tuned and send me your creations if you happen to follow along. Now, this is a base model from the SketchUp warehouse. It's called Residence 29 by Desired Space, link down below as always. Download it as a Collada file and import it. It needs some cleaning up, which we will start by merging every object with the same material. Now, how can we do that? We select a single object and we search for the option Select Linked by Material. That way, Blender will select every object that shares the same material for us. We can merge them after that, and we have a single object with all of the windows, for example, as you could see in front of you in this case. Now, this is not necessary, but it helps with optimization and keeping and having a slight lower object count. So if we happen to, for example, want to add a bevel modifier later on, we can do that in a single time. Now, as you can see in front of you, we're doing the exact same for every major object. Now, the smaller objects, I didn't really bother to do that. Let's start working on the materials. Now, for this type of foggy translucent glass, let's just set up the transmission set to 1 and set the roughness to something above 0.1, so it's slightly foggy. It gives a nice effect. I mean, ideally, this isn't the perfect material for this case. However, it looks okay in the render, and I figured why not keep it. Now, for the painted white metal, just set the base color to white, not pure white. I know that ideally the metallic shouldn't be anywhere between 0 and 1, should either be 0 or 1, but in this case I set it to 0.4 since it looks better. It looks more like painted metal than if I set it to 0 if I keep it set to 1. Now apply the bevel modifier where we need it, and for the glass material I'm adding the simplest glass material as a principal BSDF, transmission set to 1 and roughness set to 0, with the difference that the IOR will be set to 2, so it reflects a bit more. Looks more like a mirror is the easiest way to describe how it looks. Now, if you want to go ahead and just add some slight more details, you can plug the same albedo texture into the normal slot and add a bump node in between. Make sure to plug it into the height and do the same thing for the roughness, and make sure to play with the color ramp in between in order to dial the roughness a bit more. The materials that came with the actual model are not optimized for rendering in a different software, but in this case they were okay to go with. Ideally, I would highly recommend that you go ahead and use sites like AmbientCG or Quixel Bridge or Blender Kit even, or any other source. Personally, I like textures.com, I like Texture Supply, I believe what it's called, and some Viz People assets and texture packs, mostly for wood and concrete. At this point, we can go ahead and add our camera to start thinking about the composition and framing of the scene. So let's add a camera, zero out all of the rotation except the X, set it to 90 and position it somewhere where we like it. I will keep the aspect ratio the default one and set up the focal length to 28 or 26 or 24, depending on what you want to go ahead and have. Now, I am enabling the compositional guides, mainly the third, in order to help me frame the scene a bit better, and using the Shift Y in order to raise the camera without any distortion to the verticals. Now, as you could see, the asphalt is looking quite good, and we will improve it a lot later on. Now, for lighting, usually I use the sky texture, and I'm going to do that as well. However, in this case, I like to go ahead and use a really type of raw sort of HDRI. In this case, something without any type of buildings or trees or anything. So mostly just a horizon and a ground plane. I won't be using this for the final render. However, it's really good to set up the scene correctly in a more type of neutral state before adding our main lighting, which will later on be a sky and sun texture. I'm using this add-on, which is called Easy HDRI. It's really simple actually, but it gives you a really nice node system for the world shader. Now, as you could see, we have our lighting, we have our model. Now we need to start populating the scene. Now, before doing that, go ahead and fix all of the shading issues, which you can see in front of you. Now, people get stuck here and they message me all the time on Instagram or Discord. Feel free to do so as well. The fix is add a weighted normal modifier and press keep sharp. And ta-da, works well, right? So do this to every object that has an issue. Some objects it's better to keep the keep sharp off, and some objects you need to keep it on. Sometimes just shading it flat and adding a bevel modifier will do the trick, but for the most part, geometry imported from SketchUp is genuinely bad. So you need to go ahead and do some tricks, and depending on the object and geometry, each one will need some more work. Now it's time to add our grass. I'm using the Geoscatter add-on. I'm choosing our grass landscape and adding a biome from the grass blade. Now you don't have to use this at all. You can use whatever assets you have access to. You can use the regular particle system. You can use a geonode system that you have made yourself following a 5 minutes long tutorial. It doesn't really matter as long as it looks okay at the end. For me, this Geoscatter add-on really resembles Forest Pack, which something I'm really familiar with and I work with on a regular basis. I work with way more than any other scattering system. Maybe Geoscatter as well, but Geoscatter is up there with Forest Pack, although not as stable. However, it has some really nice systems and options and sliders to play with. So as you could see, I'm trying to optimize the scene, playing with the density, having this play as in the viewport in order to keep the viewport snappy. And although later on I will be changing this grass to multiple times until I settle. Now you might say, why did I show you this? Well, as I mentioned, I did no preparation, so I thought this grass would look good, but it didn't, which is why I'm going to change it later on. I also want to cast some reflections and shadows onto our rodent house, which is where I'm going to duplicate the exact same house model that we have, not all of its elements, but some of them, and merge them into a single object and position them behind the camera. Now you might say, oh well, why are you working behind the camera? We're not going to see it. You're just wasting time, you're wasting energy, you're wasting resources. I will tell you, no, that's absolutely wrong. You should think about the context around and behind and in front of the camera. Why? Because in real life, everything is relative to any other object. So if you have a house, odds are you will have a tree or another house in front of it and behind it. So that contributes to the general shadows, to the GI, to the reflections, and this is what I'm trying to replicate here. You know, if you're hardcore enough about it, you can go ahead and do this for the full neighborhood, right? Have a nice grid based on a simple plane with some subdivisions, and scatter these houses, have 2 or 3 variations, and scatter them based on the faces in the particle system. This will look even better. In this case, it's overkill for our purpose, but totally worth it if you have a more advanced and more important scene that you're willing to invest more time in. Now, as you can see in front of you, I'm just adding some shrubs from the, I'm not sure what it's even called, Polyhaven assets, I believe. Botaniq, here we go. So just adding a couple of assets and trying to populate the scene. Adding shrubs, you will see me delete some of them and bring some of them again. I can't really predict if something's going to look good. Well, you technically could, but oftentimes you're going to be wrong. So let's do the same thing, just trying to add some more context to the scene, making it look more grounded in real life, and adding some more greenery. Now, this is a tip. Try to focus on the colors green and blue. From my YouTube analytics and Facebook projects, I have, depending on the reach and conversion, it seems that the more blue and the more green, the more better performing a post or a scene is, or YouTube video is. So this is a nice tip for you. Focus on blue and green. It gives a really nice natural look, and you can feel free to experiment with whatever color you want to go ahead and use for the rest of your scene. Now, this is mostly for art viz, but feel free to play with this for other types of environments as well. Now, as you could see, I'm just adding our actual lighting setup right now, which would be a sky texture. Now, I find the sun and sky really superior to any sorts of HD rise, especially if you know how to use them. For most case scenarios, especially these sunny days, this would be the best option. Way more control, and you can play with the colors way more, and all around it's just more flexible to work with. For overcast scenes, it's slightly trickier, but for anything else, mostly sunny or sunny midday or sunsets or sunrises, this high texture, you can't really go wrong with it. It's an amazing addition. Setting the altitude to 4000, the ozone layer to 4 in order to give this a slight bluish tint. Now, obviously lowering the background strength in order to have a nicely exposed scene with the right values. So as you can see, I'm positioning the house and the tree asset to be slightly more nicer. Even if it's behind the camera, as you can see, it's casting shadows and also some reflections and contributing to the GI as well. Now, in this stage, it's only trial and error. Add whatever assets you want, play with their positioning, and just make sure that the scene doesn't get too noisy and is still easy to read. How do you do that? You zoom out of the render way too much, keep it as small as it makes sense, right? And see if you can still tell what's happening. At least you can tell that you have some shrubs. You have a house in the middle, you have a road, and you have some trees and a nice deep blue sky. You don't really have to tell if you have any sorts of puddles, if you have any damaged concrete. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the scene is readable and nice to look at and not really noisy and has way too much going on. Otherwise, people will be repulsed by it. Now, I know for a fact that you might say, well, this scene looks not as good as the previous stuff that you had done on your website or the things that you share online, or are you showing us the wrong techniques? Well, the difference is, for these YouTube videos, I'm trying to keep them as fast as possible. for a couple of factors. Mostly since people probably wouldn't want to go ahead and watch a 5 hours long tutorial. And the second factor is I genuinely do not have time for the moment being. Once I have some more leverage and I have a good enough following base that would be more invested into following the longer videos or even master classes, which, you know, for starters, I will be making some free ones. And later on, if I'm going to make something that's really, really big, I will be probably making it for a lower price in the future. But this is for debate for the moment, depending on the time and on what the audience wants. Now, as you can see, I didn't like the grass that we added, so I'm going to add a clean grass variation. You know, it's okay to go ahead and delete everything that you have done, maybe even redo the scene from scratch. It only contributes to making the scene better. You know, don't get attached to an element. You might model a prop that looks amazing and you get emotionally attracted to it. If it doesn't look good, just delete it off of the scene or keep it in a separate file for you to use in the future. Don't get emotionally attracted to any type of asset that you make. Its purpose is make the scene look better, not to be a burden to the scene. So that's one tip for you to keep in mind. Now we want to improve the asphalt. It already looks okay, the texture is great, but we want to add actual displacement. So I'm going to clean up the mesh by deleting all of the funky vertices, I guess, and turn this into a perfect plane. So we can add some subdivision cuts and it looks okay at the same time. So your best friend is the snapping tool and the X dissolve vertices and merge by distance. Now I'm redoing the unwrapping since we ruined the UV coordinates, and I'm just setting up the UVs to be correct. Now make sure that you can't see the seam from the camera's view. If it's outside, totally okay, no problem. I mean, as long as it's not going to reflect, or you can fix that in post-processing or Photoshop or DaVinci Resolve later on. Now for the material, we need to go ahead and improve it as well. But before that, we need to add our subdivision. So make the geometry perfect planes and subdivide it a couple of times. Add a displacement modifier and make sure to set the UVs, set the coordinates to UV. Choose the same texture that you have for the base color, plug it in, and as you can see, it looks really bad. Now we can go ahead to the mapping or sampling as well. Choose the box filter type and up the slider in front of you. Now as you can see, this kind of blurs the texture, so you don't have to do that in Photoshop or in any other software. Now this is a tip for you. You know, it's like a hack. I'm not sure if it's supposed to actually do that, but I tried it and it works okay for my case. I didn't even need to go outside of Blender to do this. You know, this comes to show how amazing Blender is. Now we want to add some bump, since the details here do not really tell much in terms of micro details. So I'm adding a Voronoi texture, making sure that the scale is correct and given the coordinates set up to the object. Now it's okay. Now let's mix this Voronoi with the albedo map and set it to overlay, so we have both of them set up. Set the factor to 1 and plug this into the normal slot, and with the bump node in between, make sure to plug it into the height socket. play with the strength and distance. In this case, it's okay to lower the strength as well. We want it really, really subtle. We won't probably even see it. But as you could see, it looks amazing. We have some shadows, especially if we lower this, it looks like a really worn out asphalt road, which is amazing. We want this. You can go ahead and add some puddles if you want. You can add whatever addition you want, some time, perhaps even scatter some debris and dirt and cracked asphalt, whatever you want. Maybe add some decals. But in this case, it's okay. Now, I also want the sky to be way more deep and bluish, which is why I'm going to mix two sky textures. Ignore what I'm doing right now. So, two sky textures. Plug the first one into a background node, plug the second one into a background node, and plug both of them into a mix shader node. One of them will be the direct override, and one of them will be what's actually lighting our scene. So add a light path, plug the in-camera ray to the mix shader, and now make the sky texture that's responsible for what we see, but not the actual lighting, as blue as you want. You can make it red for the fact, no one's going to tell you why did you make it red. Add a gamma node, play with the gamma, play with the hue, play with the saturation, play with the value, play with them again, until you get something that you really, really like. Personally, I would go ahead and add some clouds, maybe paint them in Photoshop or Affinity Photo, maybe add an actual image texture. But in this case, okay enough, it looks good. And generally, clouds don't look good on YouTube thumbnails, so I'm not going to do that. So already we have a nice scene, but we need a nice fall off for the horizon. So I'm adding a cube, which will be our quote-unquote fog, but not real fog. I will be doing a nice trick. So instead of adding an actual volumetric setup, I'm going to add a emission shader. You would see in a moment what I mean. So add an emission shader, but instead of plugging it into the surface, plug it into the volume. Make it really weak, as you could see, and sample a color from what you have in the scene. Now this is really weak. I'm going to make it more strong in a second, but it does have a super nice effect, as you can see in front of you. So you have free fog, and this renders extremely quickly. It doesn't intervene with VRBs. I think Blender 4.2 fixed this issue, but beforehand, when you had an actual fog and you had VRBs inside of the fog, it looks pixelated. But with this emission shader technique, it looks okay. Now for rendering, go ahead and play with the looks. I'm using AGX in this case. For this case, I'm going to keep it set to none because, it's contrasty enough from the lighting. If you do your lighting right, you probably wouldn't even need to go ahead and add any contrast unless you really want to. Add some depth of field. I'm using the photographer add-on. It's called the photographer add-on. Feel free to download it. It's really cheap. Now, play with the white balance. You can do this in Blender without any add-on. You can do this in Photoshop or Affinity Photo or, any other image editing software, even in Blender itself. But this add-on makes it more convenient and faster, which is why I'm using it. So if you don't want to buy it, just do this inside of the Blender default tools or inside of Photoshop or any other software that you have access to. Do it inside of the compositor even. Play with exposure so the scene is not overexposed nor underexposed. And we already have a super nice scene, which it took me from A to Z 55 minutes specifically while optimizing the mesh. Now for the render settings, I'm setting up the samples to 512 or 600. In this case would be more than enough. I'm going ahead to the film and setting up the width to 1.1 exactly, so the image looks more sharp. I'm going to keep the performance as default, but I'm going to also enable persistent data. Now this won't matter for a single image, but for animations it's absolutely crucial you enable this. So feel free to go ahead and use an EXR image or as OpenEXR. Make sure to use the DWAA coder. But in this case, I'm going to just keep it as a JPEG since I'm not planning to do any sorts of post-processing. Now, as you could see, we went from A to Z in a scene using a SketchUp file, which we have improved and fixed. And we have gotten a super nice result that you can post online. Now, if you happen to make this, send it to me through Instagram. I will share it on my page and I will mention you. So if this was useful to you, feel free to follow me, subscribe, maybe talk to me on Instagram or join our Discord server and drop a like. Send your thoughts, send your questions, say whatever you want to say. I'm all open ears and I answer all comments if I get around it. And I do. So until next time, take care and enjoy yourself.